everyone. I hope you were able to see that. I got a message that maybe that didn't show up as we thought it was going to, but basically we're at Parent Chat tonight and we're glad that you're here. We have two absolutely wonderful guests with us tonight who are going to shed a lot of great, shed light on a lot of great resources that are available through the Lake Washington School District. As all of you have probably heard, there's a lot of mental health struggles right now for our teens and for our children. It's not just teens anymore. It's the younger population is also having mental health struggles. So one of the things that we decided that we wanted to do through Balance in Mind is to bring you the resources so that if your child is struggling academically, they're struggling in the school situation, that you are aware of the support that is available to you through the district. And in some cases, we're going to be talking also about if you need to go outside of the school system as well, where do you go for that? But mainly we'll be focusing on the school system itself. One thing as far as housekeeping is if you have comments, we would love to hear them in the chat box, which you can find down below. And if you have questions, I would encourage you to put those in the Q&A box, because that keeps them all kind of nice and tidy in a little place where we can find them easily. Sometimes the chat box gets a little chaotic, so we want to make sure we don't miss any of those questions. So we might be asking you questions as we go too, and you can drop the answers to those questions in the chat box. Okay, so let's get started. We have about an hour, and if you've ever been to a parent chat, we know that that hour just flies by. So I want to welcome our guests. We have Johnny Fu here tonight with us with Lake Washington School District, and he is the Director of Student Services. And then we also have Dr. Hitch, who is the Executive Director of Special Services with the school district. So welcome to both of you. We really appreciate you being here with us tonight.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I want to start just to introduce the two of you. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have you do it yourselves of what your role is within the school district and what you do for the school district.
You want to go first, Dr. Hitch?
I'm happy to go first. So I'm Shannon Hitch. I am the Executive Director of Special Services for Lake Washington School District. And that means our department oversees multiple different teams. So in Special Services, we oversee health services, which is all of our nurses and the support that they provide in our schools. We oversee all of our early learning programs. So we have special education preschool, we have tuition-based preschool, we have Head Start. And then we oversee Section 504, which is a federal law that outlines how to provide supports and accommodations for students with disabilities. And then we also provide support for children in special education, which is a state and federal law around the services and resources and instruction provided to kids with disabilities. So I oversee a team of 5 directors and 3 managers, and that's the kind of daily work that happens on our team.
Dr. Hitch, that's a lot. Everything that you said there, I can only imagine the layers upon layers that goes into each of those things. So thank you for what you do for us in the district.
Absolutely.
You know, every time I hear Dr. Hitch talks about the work that they're doing in their department, it's just amazing. And I always think to myself, how do you manage all that? And so I'm always amazed by what you do. And we're student services, and we get the opportunity to work with Dr. Hitch's department often as well. And we support a lot of the gen ed sort of field side of the house, and we oversee mental health supports in the buildings. That means anywhere from contracting to school-based mental health to community-based mental health. And what are some of those partnerships look like in our system and in our community? And so we do some coordination work around mental health and building mental health supports in the building. And I also think about mental health literacy, which that's why I love coming to this group each time to talk about mental health, as well as oversee school counselors. We have about 90 plus school counselors in our district. They do amazing work anywhere from K all the way up to high school. Vastly different experiences from elementary, middle, and high, as you can imagine, developmentally where your child is. I also oversee and support attendance. Attendance is something that frequently comes up. We're actually seeing more and more how it's interwoven with mental health in terms of school refusal and anxiety. My work around mental health, around attendance specifically, is about how do we intervene with students who are persisting around school refusal or not showing up. It's no longer just about compliance. We know that students who aren't showing up to school is the tip of the iceberg. There's more, and oftentimes there's mental health and trauma behind it. So how do we help support families think through that, as well as how do we help support schools provide on time and the right types of supports and things that we're building out around there. And we're also supporting all of our schools think about the environment. How do we create environments in which students feel like they can thrive? They feel a sense of belonging, that they matter. And so that's largely our focus in our work as a department this coming year. We have a small but mighty team, as I call it. We have 3 student services specialists who are working across 55 school buildings to help think through environment and how we can create environments where students can thrive and feel like their needs are being met. And I also, in our department, we have a counselor on special assignment who works with our 90+ counselors. So similar to Dr. Hitch's department, we are busy and there's always some kind of project or work happening. And so the work is not dull. And I can never say that any one day is the same. So there's that piece. And then I have some compliance pieces around harassment, intimidation, and bullying, as well as discipline. And those are not the so fun things that I get to do, but those are things that are interrelated that sometimes mental health is wrapped up in, harassment, intimidation, bullying. Oftentimes I say there is some kind of mental health concern that's going on with that, if you're experiencing it or you're on the other end of it. So that's sort of a quick rundown overview of what student services does.
Yeah. And you say that's a quick rundown, and there was a lot in there. So just like with Dr. Hitch's role, I can only imagine your day-to-day that it's filled with a lot of different challenges. And so thank you for taking those on. One of the things, just hearing the 2 of you talk about what you do, it makes me really proud to be part of the Lake Washington School District, knowing that you're looking at these things, you're on top of it, you're working through it. And I know sometimes parents can feel like, oh, nobody's listening or nobody's doing anything in the district. And so I love that you're shedding the light. No, we're listening, we're doing stuff, and we're working on it. So thanks for that. Okay, so I've got some questions for you tonight. The first one here is, I know the answer, but I want to hear it from both of you. If your child is struggling with their mental health, which we know a lot of kids are right now, does the district or the school offer any support?
I would say absolutely. And it depends upon the child's need as to the level of support or the type of support that's provided. So we actually provide a continuum of services and supports. Everything from the supports that Johnny and his team and the counselors provide in general education, all the way through to the services and supports that our team provides in special education. And so there is a wide range of different ways that we support students in their mental health at school, and definitely a comprehensive team that's able to address the different needs. Johnny and I were talking about this earlier tonight, and we know that navigating a school system is incredibly challenging. Sometimes it's a lot of complex moving parts, and oftentimes you don't even realize that there are systems and structures in place until you're in a place of crisis. Mm-hmm. And so, and then that's a really hard time to learn what those systems and structures are. And so we were trying to figure out a way to kind of explain the different levels of intervention and supports, and we came up with an analogy. So you'll have to tell us if it's good or not. But what we basically kind of were reflecting upon is the health model, the physical health model, where, all children get colds, right? And it's hard when they have them, but for the most part, it's a natural part of growing up. It's a natural part of life. And most kids will have a cold, and it's pretty typical that they get past it. And that's kind of true for mental health with adolescents. Adolescents will go through periods during puberty and other developmental stages where they're struggling with feelings of depression or anxiety or perfectionism. And those moments are, transient, and they come and go as part of their development. And then we think about those kids where there's colds, they're getting worse, right? Like, you have to take them to the doctor. You probably need a round of antibiotics, right? Like, you have a more intensive need there. And that's when we can see a parent who has a child with a mental health challenge reaching out to their child's teacher or to their child's counselor. And that's when you're kind of saying, hey, we're seeing something more significant here that we need some intervention with. And it's within the general education programming and supports that's available at every school. Then you've got kids who get more seriously ill, right? Like, they might be hospitalized, they might need a surgery, they might have something where they are out of school for a period of time. And those kids need a more intensive intervention. So for kids who have medical or mental health diagnoses, like significant depression or significant anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder or an eating disorder, those kinds of issues, then that's when we do short-term, more intensive interventions. And that's when you might be accessing some of the contractual counselors and mental health services that Johnny and the team in his department contract for and provide and support kids with. And then we have some kids who might have a serious emergency, like no one saw it coming, and they have like a car accident or something like that, and it's a catastrophic emergency. Maybe you have a child who has attempted suicide, or you have a child who is in significant mental health crisis. That's when we bring a team out, right? We bring a team from Johnny's department, we bring a team from special services, we bring the school team in, and it's all hands on deck to support a student and their family. And then we have kids who have more lifelong illnesses, more lifelong challenges that are significantly impacting their ability to be successful, either in their own personal lives or at school. And those are the students who need much more intensive care, much more ongoing care, much more consistent supports. And that's really when special education comes into play, where we know that a child is unable to access their learning, or they require specially designed instruction, or they require weekly therapeutic services in order to make progress at school. That's the kind of supports that special education ends up providing. And so we always kind of look at that range of supports and services and try to encourage families, when you're intervening early, to start with those kind of first generalized steps. And then if the needs intensify or become more significant, or you're caught by surprise, that's when we bring in more intensive supports and a more broad range of help. You'll have to tell us if that analogy makes sense or not.
I like it. It's a great analogy. And Dr. Hitch, what I love about it is that it brings up the point of entry, so to speak. So if your child's kind of a little behind with schoolwork because they've been super anxious, that might be the teacher counselor. That's your entry point there. But so the other levels that you talked about, the contracted counselors, you get the whole team there, or you have the special education come in. Where's the point of entry for those? Is it always the counselor, or is there another place where you go to when you need this higher level help?
On our side, it's sort of multiple layers, right? It could come from a school counselor. Oftentimes, it comes from a school counselor, from our contracted services, YES, and Evergreen Health social workers. It's the school counselor, or it's our school engagement specialist. It's referred by some other adult that says, "Hey, we have some additional concerns about the student that we believe that your expertise and support would lend to supporting this student." The other thing I just want to back up one, and using Dr. Hitch's analogy, and I love it, is, we all get colds, and we don't want to look at each other like, oh, you're gonna spread something. It's about also building awareness. So like the one piece about cold is like building awareness that we all get cold, and normalizing that it's okay to have a cold, and it's okay to not be okay. So there's this other piece for our work too that Dr. Hitch and I talk about, is how do we normalize that it's okay to not be okay in times of our lives, and it's okay to ask for help. There's time for receiving and getting. And so going back to the entry points of sort of what that looks like is, how can we normalize the access so that it's okay to ask for help? And I think that's a lot of the work that we're doing in our buildings, from our school counselors and our school teachers and our adults, are just trying to normalize that it's okay if you have a cold, and we have support if you need it. And so oftentimes the entry is from another adult in the building that says, Johnny over there could benefit from some help. Would you mind connecting with this student? And there's a teaming approach similar to what Dr. Hitch says. You don't just go into a room or go some magic place. And, we use this analogy of like, you don't just go to some magic place and then you come back a magic person, right? It just doesn't happen that way. It's how can we ensure that we create continuity of care and communication so that the student feels supported in the building. And so again, that goes back to that normalizing that it's okay to have a cold, and those who are around you will help make sure that you get your water intake, your vitamin D, your, DayQuil, whatever that is that you need, so that you can navigate your environment. And so we're working on those school-based systems where we ensure that communication is key, what are the supports that are being offered, and how to support the student in the classroom. Because at the end of the day, the student goes back into the environment, right? And we want to ensure that the teachers know how to prompt, or the adults know how to prompt or support the student needs. It's not just go see your school counselor or go see YES or the social worker and you're going to be fine. It's like, how do we help communicate so that there's a continuity of care? And a lot of that work, it's modeled off of some of Shannon's work that they have done in special ed. So
I will say this, there's no one single right door that a parent has to open. There's no set expectation that they have to call this one particular person to get help. The reality is parents can ask for help from a wide variety of individuals in the school system who are deeply invested in the health and well-being of their children. So, for example, they can talk to their child's teacher. They can talk to their child's counselor. They can talk to the school nurse. They can talk to the school psychologist at the building. They can talk to the school administrator, or they can even reach out to those of us in central office. So anytime a parent needs help, they are encouraged to ask for that support to a wide variety of people. There's no one perfect way to get there. And know that those people are going to help get them to the right place to get the right supports.
So the bottom line is, go ahead, Johnny.
Sorry to interrupt. And what I love what Dr. Hitch said that I think is key is, sometimes when we're navigating difficult situations, we oftentimes feel like, am I asking the right question? And for us, it's not about asking the right question. It's just starting the dialogue and conversation. That's really what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. So it's not about asking the right question. It's about starting the dialogue.
Yeah.
I like that. And one thing that stands out to me as you're saying these things is you've got to start somewhere. And I know one of the things that I hear from parents a lot is they don't want to get the school involved. They don't want to reach out to support through the school because there's this idea that it gets on the transcript and it will affect college applications. I've heard this from a lot of parents. What do you have to say about that?
No, it's not on your child's record. It's not on your child's record that you are seeing, our YES counselor or your school counselor. It is absolutely not. And just wanting to give a very clear answer is no. So I'll start there from my side. It's like, no, it's not on your child's record.
No, there's very specific laws in our state and federally that are designed to ensure the privacy and the confidentiality for students and families. So if you were to look at an average transcript, even if you had a child with significant disabilities who is receiving a full day of support and services and special education, you would not be able to see that on their transcript. You would not be able to see that the child was evaluated for any kind of intervention or support or service. None of that information is provided without parent consent, student consent. There's a number of different protections in place so that there is no potential for discrimination or for providing information about students that was not meant to be shared. So there's a lot of protections in place for that.
That's so good to know. That's a piece that we're definitely going to make sure we let the community know, because I've heard that a lot from people that they don't want to get the school involved because of that.
Yeah.
So we mentioned already this idea of IEPs, 504s, and a lot of people don't know what those are until they need them, and then they're finding out about those. So we're trying to be proactive here and get this information out. So can you explain to people what those are and what the differences are between those two things?
Yeah. So Section 504 came out of a law that was created in the 1970s, and it was about creating accessible spaces for people with disabilities. And so it came out of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And Section 504 is meant to support those who have an identified disability by providing them with accommodations in order basically to level the playing field for them. So it's the same law, the same guidance that says you need to have ramps so that people in wheelchairs can access your school or your building. It's the same law that says that if you're struggling with attention deficit disorder, you may need to have untimed tests because it takes you longer to process and respond to questions. So it's when you say this is a disability, it interferes with a child's major life function. So school is a major life function, and they need certain accommodations in place. Special education is a more intensive support than that. So in having a Section 504 plan, you're in general education your full day, and you are simply having accommodations to help you access your education at school. In special education, there is a process that you go through where there's a formal referral. There is a team evaluation that parents have to grant consent for. And that evaluation is designed collaboratively with the families as to the areas of assessment. Then the student has to meet state and federal criteria to qualify for services. And then once they qualify for services, we have to document that their disability is interfering with their ability to access general education and make progress at school, and that it requires what we call specially designed instruction, which is more intensive instruction or small group instruction or alternative curriculums or more specific instruction in order for them to make progress. And then if they have that need, we write what's called an individual educational plan, which outlines the services and supports that that child is going to get. And so those two laws are both meant to ensure accessibility and equity for those with disabilities. One provides more intensive services than the other does. And so there is referral and evaluation as part of both of those processes, but one is more intensive than the other.
Okay. Johnny, is there anything you want to add about those explanations?
I don't, and usually a part of the evaluation process, our school counselors participate and support. And so, again, Shannon and I's departments are oftentimes attached to the hip in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question, are these 504s and the IEPs, do those go on the transcript? Because in those, it kind of details, right, some of the reasons that they would need these accommodations.
They do not. Those things are not on a child's transcript. We do encourage children and families, if the student is identified as having a disability, to learn about that disability, to learn how to advocate for themselves, and to potentially work with any kind of future educational program like college, and working with their Office of Disability Supports. More and more colleges are creating comprehensive support programs for individuals with disabilities so that they're able to have their accommodations continue in their college years. That being said, if a family was to opt out of those kinds of services and simply desire to transition to college with none of those supports in place, they can do that, and nothing on the transcript would indicate that the child was receiving special education.
So that sounds like that would come after someone says they're going to a college and then they're accepted, they say they're going there, and then they can come back to bring the IEPs and 504s up with them.
Absolutely. So they don't receive the same supports as what you would get with an IEP in college, but they do get the accommodations that a 504 plan or an IEP provide.
Okay. So if we're talking about mental health specifically, what are some potential accommodations? I know there's like hundreds. I have a list of, I think, 5 pages of them. And what are some of the main ones that, let's say someone's kid is struggling right now and to get in assignments or to do the work for various reasons, what would kind of be the top few that might be a good starting point?
Good question. And I think I'm always going to offer the caveat that it depends on the student and their unique needs, because that's the purpose of a 504 plan or an IEP, is to individualize it to the needs for each child. But it could be that a student is not required to get in front of the class and present. Maybe that is something that would flood or cause a panic attack for a child who has high anxiety. And so that student perhaps is instead allowed to simply submit a PowerPoint and not get in front of the class to present it. Or it could be that they have access to a student's notes in the class. So a lot of teachers will ask a student to take notes for kids who are absent that day or for kids who struggle with note taking. And the accommodation is that your child gets a copy of those notes. There are different assistive technology tools that sometimes are considered as accommodation. So there's note taking. Assistive technology is fascinating. And so remarkable in the doors that it opens. But there are certain programs that students can utilize to help organize their thinking for writing projects and for assignments. There are certain things that will help a child spell more effectively in their assistive technology. Some students might need an accommodation of being allowed to take a break at certain points if they're feeling overwhelmed. Some students might need an accommodation of having a locker because they need to be able to not carry around those massive backpacks that our teenagers have, because sometimes those are something that might inhibit them. So there's just a wide variety of accommodations, and it really depends on the student and their need, and then what the student is also willing to access, especially at the secondary level, because so many times we find that kids are embarrassed to access accommodations. They don't want to look different, especially in adolescence. They want to blend in. And so, a lot of times they struggle with wanting to refuse those accommodations. And that's why it's so important to include the student in the conversation about, what do you think will help? What would work for you? Are you willing to do this? Is it going to make you more uncomfortable? So having them be a part of that conversation as well.
Those are some great ones. Some of the ones that I can think of offhand too, especially for kids who are going through maybe a depressive episode or high anxiety and can't get their stuff done. Some teachers, again, doing this within a 504 will dismiss some of the assignments or say, yeah, you don't have to turn those in or shorten them up. So teachers, once they're brought into the fold and they know what's going on, then they're more willing to do some of those accommodations.
Yeah. Especially like around tests as well. And
Yeah.
so we have a lot of students, and I actually appreciate how flexible our schools have become in the past handful of years, in the sense that a lot of students want extended time on tests so they can really process it and take their time with it. And they may want to be outside of their regular classroom to do so. They want a quiet space somewhere else in the building. And that's really effective for kids with test anxiety. So sometimes those can be helpful accommodations in addition, or in an alternative to homework accommodations.
I feel like our schools have become more aware and more open to making accommodations. And just to Shannon's point, I think it's really important to match the right strategy for the student needs, and incorporating your child's voice in it is so key and critical, even at a very young age, as young as 5. And it's amazing when you incorporate your child's voice into those accommodations, how much they'll actually access that accommodation. And so I think that's one of the key pieces, is to, as parents, we have our own concerns, and we want the best for our child. And at the same time, it's also teaching our children their advocacy skills and knowing themselves really well enough to say, hey, this is what I need. And when I need it, I know how to ask and access what I need to be able to access the educational environment, or just my environment as a whole. And I think that's something that we often try to aspire to and want to aspire to, is that our children are self-advocates and well aware of what they need and be able to communicate that. And I think sometimes our concerns, right, get in the way of letting our children speak their voice and truth into, their accommodations. And so, I also think, just thinking about fidgets in general, like I always need a pen that as I am presenting, or something in my hands, or, when you walk into classrooms, you might see different chairs now. You might see a student who's pacing in the background. There are so many great things that I've seen in the classroom environment, that when you walk in, it's just a classroom. There's no difference. And you could see that students are like, this is just our classroom. This is how we learn. And we frequently as adults say, you need to take care of your own learning, and whatever that looks like. It might mean pacing, or that might mean sewing as you listen. So there's multiple ways of how to engage.
Which is also why we've seen so many kids struggling with the adjustment of coming back from COVID, because when they were doing remote learning, they were able to accommodate for themselves significantly. And so coming back into the school setting has caused challenges at times for kids, because trying to fit back into that classroom procedure and process is hard. It's like putting on a tight pair of jeans after a big dinner. Like, it's not the most comfortable fit at first.
Mhm. I like that. It's a great metaphor there. So true. And I bet the students would definitely relate to that on so many levels. Okay, so IEPs 504s. We've talked about how you get collaboration going, you get these accommodations. Clearly the IEP, that takes some time. There's an evaluation, there's a team that gets together, but 504s, from what I understand, is a little bit quicker. So, someone was asking, so let's say your child is all of a sudden experiencing heightened anxiety and can't get all the assignments done. Is it going to take months to get accommodations, or is there a way to get that 504 or just accommodations sped up a little bit?
So you're correct in the sense that a 504 oftentimes moves more quickly than a special education evaluation. Special education evaluations have very specific timelines. So it's a 25-day referral period, a 35-day evaluation period, and then a 30 calendar day period for an IEP. So it can feel like forever when you're in a difficult position, but it's also there for a reason, because we're making big decisions about students, and we are identifying them with disabilities, which kids will internalize and they will wear it for the rest of their lives. So we have to be thoughtful about that. With 504 plans, it can often move quickly in the sense that it does not require the same extensive assessment, and it does not require the formalized individual education plan. It's instead a list of accommodations developed with the 504 coordinator, the family, and hopefully the student at the secondary level. That being said, it's also important that we're thoughtful about trying different interventions in the hopes that the least restrictive, the less invasive supports are potentially sufficient to meet the child's needs. Because even with a 504 plan, students will internalize that as, I have a challenge here that makes me different than other kids, and it communicates a message that this is something I am going to be navigating for a while. And so if there are interventions that we can try that help the child be successful without having to do a formal plan, that's wonderful. But if we are dealing with something that we know is a disability that's really impacting a student, then yes, the 504 can be drafted fairly quickly, fairly efficiently.
Okay. One of the things that I've seen in action is getting the accommodations before the 504 is official. So sometimes it's, as both of you have seen, I'm sure, sometimes it's a short period of this mental health struggle. It's okay to not be okay, right? This is normal for you to have these ebbs and flows of emotions. So sometimes it is for a short period of time. You don't have to get this formalized, the 504 and IEP. So it's good to know that I don't want anybody who's listening to feel like, oh my gosh, there's this big process. It's too much time. I'm just going to pull my kid out of school, or, do something on the more drastic level, as you're talking about, Dr. Hitch, that wait a second, there are some things that can be done like pretty quickly.
Immediately. Yeah. Because the schools want your child to be successful. And a lot of times they're willing to create accommodations even without 504 plans, because they want to be there to support your student and help them be successful.
Right. Okay, we have another question. Let's say that your child has a 504 plan in place, and this is probably a relevant question for IEP as well. Is it the parent's responsibility to request a 504 plan meeting every year, or what is kind of the process for that?
No, it is not it is not required for a parent to ask for that meeting annually. It is a requirement for the school to offer that meeting annually. So that responsibility is on the school. If for some reason there's miscommunication or change of staff, or a parent wants to meet sooner, then a parent can certainly reach out and ask for a 504 review meeting at any point in time, but it's required to happen at least annually.
Okay. So the 504 does follow them to the next year. It's not like you have to redo it every year, but there might be a reassessment or just looking over it again, see if it's working, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you would expect that it would need to be adjusted depending on how that student's growing and making progress, what different subject areas they may be taking, things along those lines.
Okay. Another question, if you have a 504, an IEP, and teachers aren't giving you those accommodations, aren't supplying those to students, what do you do about that?
So there's a couple of different approaches. One thing I first recommend is that sometimes when you're worried about your student and you feel like they are really struggling, there's a desire to go in and ask for a very lengthy list of multiple accommodations. And I will say very honestly that that is very difficult for teachers to implement because there's so many moving pieces when they're navigating hundreds of students a day at the high school level. I ask parents to really think thoughtfully about what are those really important accommodations that have to be done and done with fidelity that people can really focus in on and really be clear about. Once that's been identified, if it's not being implemented, the first person that you would talk to is your child's teacher. If that does not resolve the issue, the next person that you would talk to is your child's 504 coordinator. It's very likely that's a different person. And then if it's still not resolved after that, you would go to the school principal. And if that doesn't resolve the issue, then we have a district level 504 coordinator officer in special services who you would go to next. And even then, there is still process and procedure if a family is still unhappy or still is seeking resolution, where there can be hearings with hearing officers. And so there is an entire kind of accountability chain. And we ask for parents to start at the ground level. And then if their needs are not met, then they have other options.
Okay, that's great to know. So parents, we just have to be aware and involved, and bring the student in as much as possible. Have them kind of start. If they're not getting the accommodation, be the first one to reach out if they're able to do that, so we can empower them.
I would also add this, though, as much as I encourage children to learn how to self-advocate and to ask for what they need and to ask for their accommodations, it is important to remember that these are adolescents, and a lot of them don't want to ask for help, don't want to look different, don't want to be seen as less than. If that's the case, the teacher cannot require your child to ask for the accommodations. The teacher simply has to provide them. We have to remember these are children, and that's a learning process around self-advocacy. Most adolescents struggle with that. So, they need to be provided regardless of whether or not your child asks for them. So it's an important point. Sometimes teachers, in their hopes of encouraging independence in kids, which I appreciate, may sometimes overlook that piece, but it is important to know that teachers are required to do that.
Okay, that is very good to know. Question here. Can a parent request a 504 testing of a child if they have not been privately tested? So the parent suspects that the child has maybe ADHD or something else going on, but they're not formally diagnosed yet.
They can, but it will often be a process in which the school team is going to want to work with you, potentially with your child's pediatrician, because we do not diagnose in the school system different mental health disorders or different health disorders. So we do not diagnose ADHD. We do not diagnose anxiety disorders or depression. Typically, that's done with medical practitioners or private practitioners. The school district can provide that assessment if the parent is unable to do it themselves, and there is clear evidence of need for something along those lines. The school district will step in and support that. But usually it's a collaborative process, because most of the time it requires a team approach to support a student with their own private counselor or their pediatrician or their psychiatrist or psychologist along with the school team.
Okay. So you've got to, at some point, there will be an evaluation that needs to be done by somebody. Either the district can provide it if there's financial need proven. Is that what I'm understanding there? And then otherwise it's through a private neuropsych assessment or pediatrician or somebody along those lines.
Yeah, what typically happens is if we are in need of an actual diagnosis of a psychological health issue or a medical health issue, oftentimes the school district will contract with private providers in order to provide that evaluation and diagnosis. There's a somewhat of a conflict of interest with a school district evaluating and identifying particular diagnostics than what their responsibility is, which is really to identify if there's a need for special education or 504 supports based upon a disability. Special education is a little bit different. We do identify learning disabilities. We do identify intellectual disabilities, but we don't identify health impairments. We don't identify if a child is blind or deaf or has a traumatic brain injury. Those are the kinds of diagnostics that come from private practitioners.
Okay. Another question. What do you do in situations where there's something traumatic that happens and then all of a sudden the child's abilities to focus or to get things done at school, it's like a sudden shift, right? So it might be the loss of a parent or suicide in the community or, just something that's happening in the world that's traumatic, and all of a sudden there's this shift. What does that fall under?
That falls under Johnny.
Falls under all of us. It's sadly to say the pandemic has thrown a lot of things, and I would say, one of the things that we talked about in our trainings yesterday with school teams is the pandemic broke a lot. And that's one of the things that we're noticing is even our students and the adults in our environments are coming back and just different, right? And to that question of like, what happens if there's something in the community and all of a sudden I notice that my child has begun to change? And the first thing I would say is, have you had the conversation? Have the conversation. I notice, I see, I feel that there's something that's going on, right? Can we talk, right? What are you going through? And that's always a hard conversation, but even as a teenager to even, a 5-year-old. But it's important to start the conversation, because that conversation leads to them reaching out for help, either from a community-based organization that is specific in an area of grief of loss, or specifically to that particular need. It could be loss of parent. It could be camps that is really creating a support network for students who have experienced loss through cancer or various others. And so getting clear with your child around what specifically has changed in their life that's causing either some changes in their in their behaviors, or just their personality, because we see that, right? ex- I'm in the middle of something.
I can't fall asleep.
Okay, I will be right in your room.
Oh,
I will be right in your room. So yes, you can. I love you.
His little ones are precious.
oh my gosh.
I thought that's my 6-year-old talking about
So cute.
6-year-olds, right?
Yes.
She's not supposed to be in bed. And so start the conversation with your child, and that's where the conversation can be with their school counselor or a caring adult. Even I would even ask, if your child is clamming up, because we all have that experience where your child just clams up on you and just doesn't want to talk. The question is, who's a caring adult in your life that you feel like you can talk to, that I can reach out and say, hey, can you please talk to Bella? Something's wrong and I just don't know what, or something's off. Can you? And then that kind of translates into school. If school notices a difference, the hope is there's communication with the family or at home and say, hey, are you noticing the change too? Because if family, you're not noticing the change, but we're noticing the change at school, well, there's something going on at school. It could be harassment, intimidation. It could be, peers. It could be a lot of things that's going on. And so it is the job of sort of like on the adult side of, how do we ask the question of what's going on and how can we help and support in a caring and loving way, which is challenging, right? Because the teenager might be like, I don't want to talk to you or get away from me, but how persistent can we get? And that's what our school counselors are there for. That's why we have access to mental health clinicians at the high school and middle school level that's full-time at each and every building. And that's also where we have access to community, where, hey, if it's a particular topic that we can help access you and your family to, we're going to work on that. And, one of the things that I really believe about this work is schools can't do it alone. We have to think about it in like a community sense. So, the students with us for 7.5 hours, the rest is out in the community and with families. And so what is the linkage in which we can partner and talk? And Dr. Hitch has talked a lot about teaming. And so for me, it's what are the teaming opportunities we might bring in outside providers when we have a deaf in our community. And we will specifically create student support groups if there's a need in our building. And so as a system, one of the things that I've been really pleased with over the last few years is when there's a need, we can ask our community because we've developed partnerships. Prime example is Balance of Mind. We've had tragic incidents that has happened in our community. And you guys have stepped up when we've called and say, we know our families are hurting, or we know our students are hurting. Is there an opportunity in which you can create a support group or even a chat? And that's where the community, you guys step up and do that. And so I would say it's a collaboration and partnership, and it's understanding the student needs to be able to drive what is our responsive support for the student. And it's not reactive. I want to be clear, like it's not reactive. Sometimes we have to react to situations. This is really better understanding where our students are coming to us, where they're coming from, and just know like there's national events that happen, or state level or local level events that happen that we know that school is not immune to, right? I wish we had this bubble where your child can just come through and we can leave all that stuff out the door, especially social media, or throw phones away. But we know that that's not the case. And so we have to do a better job in really focusing on our relationships with our children and our students on an ongoing basis to understand that hey, there's a change and I need to ask, what are the right questions to ask, right? Like,
Mhm.
hey, I noticed that you're not doing this anymore. Or I noticed that you don't have a smile like you used to. I noticed that you don't have the same level of energy, or I noticed that, for instance, PE for some students can be very difficult, and they can say, hey, I have a stomach ache. So these are some of the things that can begin to persist that we should be talking with our families with and with our children about often.
Here's what's so wonderful and loving about how you've put those. It's not about your grades are falling, you need to get those up, or you didn't do the dishes, go do them. It's about, wait a second, I'm noticing these changes. And so you're not getting onto them about what they're not doing well or what they're not doing right. You're saying, wait a second, I'm noticing something. I care about you and I love you. So let's talk about this. So you're really, the way you're wording it is being very careful that you're not going to create a defensive child, a defensive response, and you're not going to shut them down, which is so key in this. We are almost out of time. Time just flies. So I have one more question to ask you. Somebody's asking about temporary struggles. So let's say, in this day and age, let's say your child gets COVID and they're out for a week, or they get a cold, or they break their leg, whatever it is, but it's a temporary setback. But I think the policy, from what I always hear, is if you're out sick 3 days, you've got 3 days to make up the stuff. So what is the policy, and how do you get kind of temporary accommodations, or what do you do in those situations?
Yeah, and there's and we can talk about attendance. When it is an excuse absent, your child has access to all their educational opportunities that they miss. And that's a conversation with the teacher. And I know that this can create, I'm thinking about downstream, particularly at our high school. I'm just going to say May in particular, because that's AP testing, or, January or during midterms. I know that that's stressful, and that's where the conversation with the teacher is really important. Like, I know you got to teach. I'm not asking you to go back all 3 days. What I'm asking is, what did my child miss, and how can we work on making some of that materials or homework or in the world of COVID. Again, COVID happens, we all get sick, and I believe that our world for the better has shifted and said, things happen, you're right, and how can we make some accommodations? So I feel like our system is much better now at creating accommodations and saying, okay, you were sick and there's a lot of grace, and how do we help you catch up? Or how do we potentially, one of the accommodations can be like, well, the test was going to be on Friday, but let's have you take the test on Wednesday after school, right? So I think there's just more understanding that life happens, and yes, school doesn't stop, but school can accommodate your needs.
I would absolutely agree with that, because I have a sophomore in Redmond High School, and the second week of school he got COVID, and he was out for almost 2 full weeks, right? And with 7 classes and one of them being an AP class, that is not an easy load. And he was actually like sick, right? So he can't do the work while he's feeling cruddy. And the reality is, each and every one of his teachers worked with him. And it's a matter of encouraging him to talk with his peers who can give some support and also some learning. And he gets to catch up with his friends. And it's also working with his teachers around when he can take tests, not worrying about the homework that was due to be turned in at that period. Those kinds of considerations. If you have teachers that are more resistant to those kinds of accommodations, that's when you would likely go to your child's counselor or the principal to get some additional guidance and supports. Because most of the time, our teachers want to make things work for kids, but they also get overwhelmed too. And so
Mhm.
sometimes they need support in helping with those pieces. There
Absolutely.
are other protections in place for kids who are out for longer periods of time. There's things like home hospital. There's different ways that kids can get support at school if they fall behind. But for the most part, most teachers are going to accommodate it.
Okay, that's good to know. So it's time to wrap up. Johnny and Dr. Hitch, I just want to ask, is there any last minute things that you feel like you just really need to say? Need to end things with?
This hour just always goes by really fast. And
Yes.
again, I just appreciate the space that Balance in Mind offers for parents and just for our community. And again, just a collaboration around that mental health. It's not just a school issue, but it's a community issue that we can really come together around. And so I always appreciate the space that Sheri and Balance in Mind you guys offer.
I would completely agree with that. And I would also just say that if there was ever a time and space for grace for ourselves as parents, for our children, and for our teachers, it's now, because everybody has struggled over the past couple of years in different ways. And it's only by working together in community and collaboratively and having grace with one another that we're able to kind of find the success that we're looking for.
So true. The words that kind of stand out for me that have come up around this topic is collaboration, teamwork, community, and compassion. And all of it boils down to that as we're trying to figure out how to best support our kids to work within the school district. We have to have all of those things combined to just have the best situation for our kids. And knowing that the two of you are there helping out in the system, it really means a lot. And I hope that the parents listening really figure out now that there is support within the school district that they can reach out for. So thank you so much, Johnny and Dr. Hitch, for being here tonight. Thank you to all of the parents for being here. If before you leave, you can put in the chat box just an aha moment or something you felt like, I wish every parent knew this. That's very helpful for us. And obviously any sorts of issues that you have or that you want us to talk about, you can put those in the chat box as well. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. And I hope you will join us for our next parent chat, which I'm going to put a screen up that has that on there. I always forget the dates. And if someone from the team can put that in the chat box, that would be great. Maybe the next two that are coming up. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a wonderful night.